On December 26, 1991, a flag that had flown for 69 years came down forever. No war was fought that day. No city was bombed. No shots were fired. But with one signature, the world's first communist superpower ceased to exist. The Soviet Union was gone, and 290 million people woke up the next morning living in 15 different countries. Think about that for a second. Imagine waking up and the country you were born in, the country on your passport, the country you pledged allegiance to, no longer exists. That's what happened in Moscow, in Kyiv, in Almaty, in Riga, all on the same day. For nearly 50 years, the USSR had been the other half of the world. It was capitalism versus communism. It was the United States versus the Soviet Union, two superpowers with enough nuclear weapons to end life on Earth several times over. It was the Cold War, a conflict fought not with battles on European soil, but through proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, through propaganda, espionage, and the race to space. Everyone thought this standoff would last forever. The Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain, the nuclear stalemate, it all felt permanent. It wasn't. The collapse started quietly in 1985, when a 54-year-old man named Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was different from the leaders before him. He was younger. He had traveled to the West. He understood that the Soviet system was in trouble. Factories were inefficient. Innovation had stalled. The average Soviet citizen waited in line for bread while watching Western television shows smuggled in on VHS tapes. The gap between the promise of communism and the reality of daily life was becoming impossible to ignore. Gorbachev's answer was two reforms. The first was glasnost, which means openness. For the first time since Stalin's purges, people could speak freely. Newspapers could report on corruption. Historians could write about the millions who died in labor camps. Writers could publish books that had been banned for decades. The second reform was perestroika, or restructuring. It was an attempt to introduce limited market elements into the planned economy. Let state factories sell some of their goods at market prices. Allow small private businesses to exist. On paper, it made sense. In practice, it was like trying to fix a sinking ship by removing the walls. Glasnost didn't create trust, it created rage. When people learned the full scale of Stalin's terror, when they saw how much money had been stolen by party officials, when they realized how far behind the West the Soviet economy had fallen, they didn't become loyal reformers. They became cynical and angry. Perestroika was even worse. It dismantled parts of the old command economy without replacing them with anything that worked. Prices rose. Goods disappeared. Corruption got worse, not better. Gorbachev had opened the cage, and he couldn't control what came out. Then came August 1991, the moment when everything broke. Hardline communists in the KGB and the military panicked. They believed Gorbachev's reforms were destroying the Soviet Union, so they tried to overthrow him. They placed him under house arrest in Crimea and declared a state of emergency in Moscow. Tanks rolled into the city. It looked like a return to Stalinism, but it failed in 3 days. And the reason it failed changed history, because Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, climbed on top of a tank outside the Russian Parliament building and gave a speech defying the coup. The image was broadcast live across the Soviet Union. For the first time, millions of people saw the Communist Party lose. They saw the army hesitate. They saw that the government could be defied and survive. The fear was gone. And once the fear was gone, the Soviet Union had nothing left. A system built on repression cannot survive without repression. After the coup failed, the republics moved fast. One by one, they declared independence. Ukraine, the second most powerful republic, voted 90% for independence in a referendum on December 1st. That was the death blow, because without Ukraine, the Soviet Union was no longer a union. It was just Russia with some land attached. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in secret in a hunting lodge in Belovezha Forest. They signed the Belovezha Accords. The document stated that the Soviet Union, as a subject of international law, had ceased to exist. They created a new organization called the Commonwealth of Independent States to replace it. It was a soft landing, or at least that was the idea. On December 25th, Christmas Day, Mikhail Gorbachev gave his resignation speech on live television. He spoke for 10 minutes. He said he was stepping down because the office of president had ceased to exist. That night, at 7:32 p.m. Moscow time, the red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. It was replaced by the pre-Soviet Russian tricolor. Millions watched on television, both inside the USSR and around the world. And on December 26th, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR met for the last time. They passed Declaration 142N. It formally dissolved the Soviet Union. The meeting lasted 10 minutes. No one debated it. No one opposed it. There was nothing left to debate. So what actually killed the Soviet Union? It wasn't one thing. It was four forces hitting at the same time, and none of them could be solved alone. First, the economy collapsed. The Soviet Union was a petrostate. It sold oil and gas to Europe to buy grain and technology from the West. When global oil prices crashed from $120 a barrel in 1980 to $24 in 1986, the budget collapsed. The government had no money to import food, to maintain factories, or to pay soldiers. Store shelves went empty. Inflation hit 2,000% in some years. People had money, but there was nothing to buy with it. The black market became the real economy. Second, military spending bled the country dry. The Soviet Union spent between 15 and 20% of its GDP on defense. For comparison, the United States, at the height of the Cold War, spent about 7%. On top of that, the war in Afghanistan lasted 10 years and cost 15,000 Soviet lives and billions of rubles. It was Vietnam for the Soviets. It drained money, morale, and political legitimacy. Gorbachev couldn't afford the Cold War anymore. Third, nationalism exploded. The Soviet Union was never one nation. It was 15 republics with different languages, histories, and cultures held together by the Communist Party and the KGB. Once Glasnost lifted censorship, those identities came back fast. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had been annexed by force in 1940. In 1989, 2 million people formed a human chain 600 kilometers long from Tallinn to Vilnius to demand independence. It worked. By 1991, all three were free. Once the Baltics left, the others realized they could leave too. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Georgia, Armenia. All of them had their own movements. The Soviet Union was only held together by force and the fear of force. When that went away, the Union fell apart. Fourth, the Soviet Union lost its empire in Eastern Europe. In 1989, communist governments collapsed across Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. The Berlin Wall fell. For 40 years, Eastern Europe had been the Soviet Union's buffer zone and its proof that communism was expanding. Gorbachev refused to send tanks to keep them in line. He said he wanted a common European home. But without Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union lost its superpower status overnight. It was no longer a global system. It was just a big country with internal problems. Now, the collapse didn't end the story. It started a new one, and that story is still being written today. Russia became the main successor state. It inherited 75% of the Soviet Union's territory, 80% of its population, and 100% of its nuclear arsenal. It also inherited the seat on the UN Security Council and about $100 billion in Soviet foreign debt. The 1990s in Russia were brutal. Hyperinflation wiped out savings. State industries were sold off for pennies in rigged privatizations. Organized crime grew powerful. Life expectancy for men dropped by 6 years. It was a trauma that shaped Russian politics for the next 30 years. Ukraine, Belarus, and the other republics had to build new states from nothing. Some did better than others. The Baltic states joined the European Union and NATO by 2004. Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan used oil wealth to stabilize. Others, like Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine, faced frozen conflicts, corruption, and Russian pressure. The borders drawn in 1991 were administrative lines inside the USSR, not international borders. When the USSR disappeared, those lines became real, and that created problems that still exist. Globally, the collapse ended the bipolar world. The United States became the sole superpower. NATO, which was created to contain the Soviet Union, didn't disband. It expanded east. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined in 1999. The Baltics joined in 2004. For Russia, this looked like a betrayal of promises made in 1990. For Eastern Europe, it looked like security after decades of occupation. That tension is still at the heart of European politics. And the nuclear question was massive. After 1991, nuclear weapons were scattered across 4 countries: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. In 1994, under the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine gave up the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal in the world in exchange for security guarantees from Russia, the US, and the UK. That decision is debated constantly today. The cultural impact was huge too. For 70 years, the Soviet Union tried to create a Soviet person, a new type of human without national identity, without religion, loyal only to the state. It failed. When the state collapsed, those older identities came back immediately. Russian, Ukrainian, Kazakh, Armenian, Muslim, Orthodox, Jewish. They had never really gone away. They were just suppressed. And economically, the collapse created the largest peacetime transfer of wealth in history.